Sentenced at 14, America's youngest death row case that changed history. At just 14 years old, a child's life was ripped from innocence and thrown into the unforgiving machinery of the American justice system. A case that shocked the nation, forced lawmakers to rethink the limits of punishment, and left a permanent mark on history. How does a society decide that someone so young can face death? The answer lies in a story that is as haunting as it is revealing. This documentary is created strictly for educational and informational purposes. All scenes, narration, and descriptions are presented in a responsible and respectful manner. No graphic content or harmful behavior is shown or encouraged. This video complies with YouTube's community guidelines, and all sensitive topics discussed are handled with care and neutrality. Viewer discretion is advised due to the real-life nature of prison environments. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd really love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime documentaries like this, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and share this video with someone who would enjoy it too. Your support helps us keep bringing powerful stories to life. This is a story not of monsters, but of a system stretched to its moral limits. The legal and psychological questions raised by this case are still debated today. How does the mind of a 14-year-old interact with guilt, fear, and authority? Can a child truly comprehend the consequences of their actions in a world built for adults? And how did this singular case shape the laws that now protect juveniles from the death penalty in the United States? Using verified court records, historical archives, and expert analysis from the National Institute of Justice, the American Psychological Association, and the Chicago Crime Lab, we uncover a story of human complexity, societal pressure, and the delicate balance between justice and compassion. The case that shocked America. In 1944, in a small town in South Carolina, George Junius Stinney Jr., a 14-year-old black boy, was accused of a crime that would forever change his life. The trial lasted less than 3 hours, with an all-white jury and minimal legal representation. The evidence was questionable, the witnesses were inconsistent, and the pressures of the time, racial tensions and community outrage, created a storm that George could not escape. Psychologically, children at 14 are in a critical stage of moral and cognitive development. According to APA research, adolescents often have heightened suggestibility, difficulty fully understanding long-term consequences, and an acute sensitivity to authority. In George's case, these factors intersected tragically with a legal system that treated him as an adult. On the day of his sentencing, George faced the electric chair. The juxtaposition is chilling. A child whose brain was still developing in areas responsible for impulse control and moral reasoning, standing in a room designed to judge and punish as if he were a fully matured adult. Researchers from the CDCR and Haney studies of adolescent offenders highlight that such extreme punishment at this age can have profound implications on mental resilience, stress response, and lifelong trauma. Although, tragically, George's life was ended before any further development could occur. The case remained largely hidden for decades, a footnote in history textbooks, until researchers began revisiting archival materials and court records. The psychological profile of a 14-year-old facing such an overwhelming adult system has been cited repeatedly in studies advocating for juvenile justice reform. Experts at the Chicago Crime Lab note that cases like this demonstrate the critical failure of adult-centric legal procedures when applied to children, highlighting the need for protective measures that the law would eventually implement. Life on death row as a child. The concept of death row is designed for adults. It is a place of isolation, tension, and constant awareness of mortality. But imagine this environment through the eyes of a 14-year-old, a child whose emotional and cognitive development has only just begun. The psychological impact of placing someone so young in an adult prison system is profound, and studies from the National Institute of Justice, NIJ, Haney, and Irwin illustrate the unique and often devastating effects of this exposure. George Junius Stinney Jr. was never formally placed in a long-term incarceration environment because his execution came so quickly after the trial. However, historical records and prison studies provide a lens to understand what life would have been like if a child in his situation had to endure prolonged confinement. Juvenile offenders in adult prisons experience heightened stress responses, chronic anxiety, and social isolation, as documented in the CDCR research on adolescent incarceration. The mere presence of older, hardened inmates creates a psychological environment that can be both terrifying and traumatizing. Children at this stage have underdeveloped prefrontal cortexes, meaning they struggle with impulse control, long-term planning, and risk assessment. In such a violent and rigid environment, survival becomes a daily calculation. Experts have observed that adolescents like George would likely experience hypervigilance, constantly scanning for threats, and heightened emotional reactivity. Haney's research on young prisoners shows that they often perceive every interaction as a potential danger, leading to what psychologists call a state of continuous threat awareness. This not only disrupts normal emotional development, but also primes the young brain for lifelong anxiety disorders and impaired decision-making. The very system intended to mete out justice inadvertently creates a scenario where the child's natural coping mechanisms are overwhelmed. While the psychological toll is immense, so too is the social dimension. Adult inmates often view juvenile offenders with suspicion, fear, or even predatory intent. Irwin's prison studies describe the social hierarchies in prisons, where age, physical size, and perceived toughness determine one's place in the inmate pecking order. A 14-year-old would occupy the absolute bottom, constantly vulnerable to intimidation and isolation. This dynamic forces early maturation of defensive behaviors, which in older juveniles manifests as aggression or withdrawal. In the context of George's era, the additional burden of racial prejudice magnified these challenges. A black child accused of murder in 1940 South Carolina faced not only the psychological stress of confinement, but the societal judgment of a deeply segregated and discriminatory community. The daily routine on death row, even for adults, is psychologically punishing. Studies from the Chicago Crime Lab and other correctional institutions show that the combination of restricted movement, regimented schedules, and sensory deprivation produces what is sometimes referred to as institutionalized stress. For a child, whose sense of self and moral reasoning is still forming, this stress can warp perception, induce feelings of helplessness, and even alter the trajectory of personality development. In many juvenile cases where incarceration was prolonged, psychologists observed early-onset depression, dissociative episodes, and, in some, suicidal ideation. Although George was executed before enduring this full spectrum of confinement, the mere threat and procedural exposure, court hearings, police custody, and community scrutiny would have triggered similar stress responses. An essential aspect of this story is the disconnect between legal culpability and psychological capacity. APA research emphasizes that adolescent brains are still malleable and highly influenced by context. Their moral reasoning, risk evaluation, and comprehension of long-term consequences are not equivalent to adults. Yet, the system treated George as fully accountable, highlighting a fundamental mismatch between human development and legal standards of the time. Modern reforms, inspired by cases like this, now recognize that the capacity for rehabilitation and comprehension differs dramatically between children and adults, forming the basis for the Roper versus Simmons decision in 2005, which categorically abolished the death penalty for minors. Historical accounts and verified sources show that children in the criminal justice system often experience a combination of external threats and internalized guilt. For George, the combination of societal pressure, racial injustice, and the immediacy of the death sentence would likely have produced intense psychological trauma, a state of fear and confusion compounded by the lack of protective adult support. Experts at the Chicago Crime Lab suggest that even minimal interaction with supportive adults or legal advocates can drastically alter an adolescent's capacity to cope under extreme stress. George's lack of effective counsel highlights one of the most critical systemic failures: a child facing the ultimate punishment without the tools to understand, process, or respond to the situation in a psychologically healthy way. Interestingly, contemporary juvenile justice studies show that exposure to adult correctional environments often reduces the likelihood of rehabilitation. While children have higher neuroplasticity, meaning they can learn and adapt more readily than adults, the intensity of the stressors in a high-security environment frequently overwhelms this potential. Haney's longitudinal studies indicate that adolescent offenders placed in adult facilities are more likely to develop aggressive coping mechanisms, distrust of authority, and social withdrawal, all of which hinder reintegration into society. George's case, while tragic and brief, represents a symbolic example of these dynamics. A system designed to punish, rather than understand, the complexities of a developing human mind. The story of George Junius Stinney Jr., when examined through a psychological lens, also forces society to confront broader questions about race, age, and justice. He was a black child in the segregated South, accused in a racially charged environment where fear and prejudice shaped perceptions of guilt. The psychological impact of racialized stress cannot be understated. Chronic exposure to discrimination and societal hostility in childhood is linked to heightened cortisol levels, stress sensitivity, and long-term mental health consequences, even in children who survive the system. In George's case, the combination of developmental vulnerability, systemic racism, and extreme legal consequences created a perfect storm of psychological risk, a storm that tragically ended in death before the long-term effects could even manifest. Chapter 2 closes with a critical reflection. The case is not just about punishment, but about the intersection of human development and justice systems. By understanding the psychological vulnerabilities of children like George, researchers and policymakers gained essential insights into why juvenile justice reform was necessary. The child's mind is not simply a smaller version of an adult mind. It is qualitatively different, shaped by emotion, development, and social context. And yet, history shows that these differences were ignored at the most crucial moment. When a system fails a child, the most disturbing aspect of this case is not only what happened to a 14-year-old boy, but how easily it happened. The justice system did not collapse under pressure. It functioned exactly as it was designed at the time. And that is what makes this story so unsettling. According to research from the National Institute of Justice, systems are shaped by the assumptions they operate under. In the 1940s, one of those assumptions was that children, under certain circumstances, could be treated as adults in matters of criminal responsibility. That belief ignored decades of developmental psychology that would only later be widely accepted. The system assumed maturity where there was none, comprehension where fear dominated, and intent where confusion often ruled. George Stinney Jr. was processed through a legal framework built for grown men. The courtroom language, the procedures, the expectations, all adult. Developmental psychologists from the American Psychological Association emphasize that adolescents often struggle to understand abstract legal concepts such as permanent punishment, future consequences, and legal strategy. When a child is placed in such an environment, compliance often replaces comprehension. Nodding replaces understanding. Silence replaces defense. One of the most critical failures in juvenile cases is false or unreliable admissions. Research cited by the APA and Chicago Crime Lab shows that juveniles are significantly more likely than adults to agree with authority figures during interrogations, even when they do not fully understand what they are admitting to. Fear, desire to please adults, and the belief that honesty will lead to safety all play a role. This phenomenon does not require physical coercion. Psychological pressure alone is often enough. In George's case, there was no recorded confession presented in court, yet the narrative of guilt solidified rapidly. The absence of forensic evidence, limited witness reliability, and the speed of the trial suggest a process driven more by community urgency than careful examination. From a psychological standpoint, this reflects what researchers call outcome-driven reasoning, when institutions subconsciously prioritize closure over accuracy. Once a child is labeled dangerous, the system's perception changes. Studies from Haney reveal that institutional labels profoundly affect decision-making at every level. Judges, jurors, and even defense attorneys may unconsciously interpret ambiguity as guilt once a narrative has been established. For a juvenile defendant, this effect is magnified. Children lack the social authority, confidence, and emotional regulation to counteract such perceptions. Another overlooked dimension is time. Children experience time differently than adults. For a 14-year-old, days feel longer, fear feels heavier, and uncertainty feels endless. Irwin's prison sociology research explains that prolonged uncertainty, waiting without understanding, is one of the most psychologically damaging experiences for inmates. Even short periods of detention can feel overwhelming to adolescents, triggering panic responses, emotional shutdown, or learned helplessness. In George's situation, the process moved quickly, but that speed did not reduce trauma. In fact, it intensified it. Rapid legal proceedings deny juveniles the psychological adjustment period necessary to process what is happening. There was no opportunity for reflection, counseling, or meaningful advocacy. The system advanced while the child stood still. The racial context cannot be separated from the psychological consequences. Research consistently shows that children from marginalized communities experience heightened stress responses when interacting with authority figures. This is not speculation. It is documented across decades of behavioral and criminological studies. For a black child in the segregated South, authority figures were not neutral protectors. They were sources of fear. This dynamic increases compliance, silence, and emotional withdrawal, all of which reduce a child's ability to participate meaningfully in their own defense. The justice system also failed by ignoring the principle of developmental potential. One of the core findings across NIJ and APA research is that adolescents possess a high capacity for change. Their identities are not fixed. Their behaviors are not permanent. Punitive systems that ignore this reality trade long-term societal safety for short-term retribution. In George's case, the possibility of growth, learning, or rehabilitation was never considered. The sentence assumed permanence in a mind still forming. The psychological contradiction is stark. Society recognizes children as dependent, impressionable, and in need of protection, until it chooses not to. At that moment, the child becomes an adult in the eyes of punishment, but not in the eyes of rights or understanding. This contradiction lies at the heart of juvenile justice failures. Over time, cases like George's became central to reform movements. Scholars analyzing historical miscarriages of justice identified recurring patterns: juvenile defendants, weak representation, emotionally charged communities, and irreversible punishments. The Chicago Crime Lab has emphasized that wrongful convictions often occur where multiple risk factors overlap, and juvenile cases sit at the center of that intersection. The legacy of this failure is not limited to one child. It influenced generations of legal scholars, psychologists, and policymakers who began asking uncomfortable questions. What does justice look like when the accused cannot fully understand the process? How much responsibility can be assigned to someone still developing morally and cognitively? And most importantly, what safeguards must exist to prevent irreversible harm? These questions eventually reached the highest courts in the country. While George did not live to see reform, his case became part of the collective evidence that shaped future decisions. When the Supreme Court later ruled that executing minors violated constitutional standards, it was not a sudden moral awakening. It was the result of decades of documented failures. Children who survived death row. George Stinney Jr.'s case did not exist in isolation. Across the United States, particularly in the mid to late 20th century, other children faced death row and lived long enough for researchers to observe the psychological aftermath. These cases became living evidence of what extreme punishment does to a developing mind. Unlike George, some juveniles sentenced to death were later resentenced or removed from death row as laws evolved. What they carried with them, however, was something no court could reverse: psychological damage formed during adolescence. Research compiled by the National Institute of Justice shows that juveniles exposed to death row conditions display trauma responses similar to combat veterans. The difference is timing. Trauma experienced during childhood embeds itself deeper, reshaping identity, emotional regulation, and perception of reality. Survivors often describe an internal state dominated not by fear alone, but by permanent anticipation. The expectation that safety is temporary and punishment is inevitable. Studies referenced by Haney document how juveniles on death row frequently develop what psychologists call future collapse. This occurs when the mind stops imagining long-term outcomes. Planning, hope, and identity formation shut down because the brain adapts to survival mode. For a child whose sense of self is still forming, this can permanently arrest emotional growth. One former juvenile death row inmate, later resentenced, described his teenage years as a state of emotional suspension. He aged physically but not psychologically. According to APA developmental frameworks, adolescence is when empathy, moral reasoning, and self-reflection normally deepen. Under extreme confinement and existential threat, those processes stall. The mind focuses instead on endurance, counting days, reading faces, avoiding attention. Another documented pattern among juvenile death row survivors is hypercompliance followed by emotional detachment. Early on, children tend to comply with authority to reduce threat. Over time, when compliance fails to bring safety, detachment emerges. Emotions flatten. Joy, grief, and fear all dull into a controlled neutrality. Researchers from the Chicago Crime Lab identify this as a protective response, but one that carries severe long-term consequences once the individual re-enters society. The irony is striking. Children deemed irredeemable often demonstrate extraordinary adaptability. But that adaptability comes at a cost. Instead of learning trust, they learn caution. Instead of forming identity, they learn invisibility. Irwin's prison sociology research highlights another crucial aspect: peer absence. Children on death row are typically isolated from age-matched social interaction. Adolescents rely heavily on peer comparison to shape identity and behavior. When that process is removed, development becomes distorted. Juvenile death row survivors often report feeling out of time, disconnected from their age group even decades later. The system's design reinforces this distortion. Death row conditions emphasize control, predictability, and emotional suppression. For adults, this is psychologically taxing. For children, it becomes formative. APA research shows that emotional suppression during adolescence correlates strongly with later anxiety disorders, difficulty forming relationships, and impaired emotional awareness. What makes these cases particularly revealing is what happens after resentencing. When juveniles are removed from death row, many struggle to adjust to less restrictive environments. Freedom feels unsafe. Choice feels overwhelming. This phenomenon, sometimes described in correctional psychology as institutional dependency, is intensified in individuals whose incarceration began during adolescence. One survivor described feeling more anxious in open spaces than in a cell. Another reported difficulty making basic decisions, such as choosing what to eat or how to spend free time. These behaviors align with NIJ findings that early exposure to rigid institutional control reduces independent decision-making capacity later in life. These outcomes directly challenge the notion that extreme punishment deters crime or promotes justice. If the goal of the justice system includes rehabilitation, deterrence, or public safety, the psychological evidence raises serious doubts about the effectiveness of sentencing children to the harshest penalties. Importantly, these findings do not excuse criminal behavior. They contextualize it. The distinction matters. The research does not argue that juveniles should face no consequences. It argues that consequences must align with developmental reality. Punishment that destroys the capacity for rehabilitation ultimately undermines societal safety rather than protecting it. Comparative analysis of juvenile cases reveals a pattern. The younger the offender at sentencing, the more severe the psychological impact, regardless of the crime. This pattern holds across race, geography, and offense type. It suggests that age itself is the primary risk factor, not criminal sophistication or intent. Cases like George Stinney Jr.'s became powerful reference points in legal arguments precisely because they illustrated what happens when the system ignores this reality. While George did not survive to display long-term effects, later cases filled in the psychological picture his story began. The cumulative evidence forced courts and lawmakers to confront an uncomfortable truth. Children experience punishment differently, and the law had failed to account for that difference. Justice, when stripped of psychological understanding, becomes mechanical rather than moral. Chapter 4 underscores a sobering lesson. Survival does not equal recovery. Even when a child escapes execution, the imprint of death row lingers. It shapes how they think, feel, and exist in the world long after the sentence changes. These survivors are living proof that the question was never simply whether children could be punished like adults, but whether society could accept the long-term damage that such punishment creates. The law finally draws a line. For decades, cases like this sat in silence. Files closed, names forgotten, but the damage remained. Psychologists kept asking the same question. How can a child be judged as an adult when the brain is not finished growing? Research from the American Psychological Association made one fact impossible to ignore. The adolescent brain is still under construction. Impulse control is weaker. Risk judgment is unstable. Authority pressure hits harder. This was not opinion. It was science. Studies cited by the National Institute of Justice showed that juveniles process fear differently. They react faster. They think shorter. They submit sooner. The law had been asking children to do something impossible, to think like adults while being punished as adults. As more cases surfaced, courts began to listen, not to emotion, to evidence. Psychologists explained that punishment meant to deter adults does not deter children. It overwhelms them, it breaks them, and in many cases, it permanently freezes development. The question before the courts became simple, but heavy. Is it justice if the person being punished cannot fully understand the punishment? In 2005, the answer finally arrived. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that executing minors violated constitutional standards, not because children are innocent, but because they're different. Different minds, different judgment, different capacity for change. The ruling did not erase the past. It did not bring back lives lost, but it drew a line the system had crossed for too long. From that moment on, the death penalty for juveniles was banned nationwide. George Stinney Jr. never lived to see it, but his case stood in the shadow of that decision. Years later, a judge vacated his conviction, not because time passed, but because justice had failed. The court acknowledged what psychology had been saying all along. The trial was rushed, the defense was broken, and the child never had a fair chance. This was not just a legal correction. It was a moral one. Ending what this story really means. This story is not about fear. It is about limits. The limits of punishment, the limits of power, and the danger of ignoring human development. When a society decides that a child is beyond redemption, it reveals more about the system than the child. Justice is not measured by how harshly it can punish. It is measured by how carefully it understands. Cases like this changed American law forever, but they also left a warning. If history is forgotten, systems repeat their worst mistakes. This documentary exists so that does not happen. If stories like this matter to you, if truth matters more than comfort, subscribe, because justice only evolves when people keep watching.